October 24, 1944. The Philippine Sea is a vast, undulating sheet of hammered cobalt, occasionally broken by the white scars of wake and the oily black plumes of dying ships. Below the flight deck of the USS Essex, the air is thick not with the copper tang of blood, but with the incongruous sweet scent of fresh-baked bread and the sharp, antiseptic sting of degreaser. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, his flight suit a charred ruin of silk and sweat, is led by two towering Marines through the steel labyrinth of the ship. His hands are bound, his spirit, the Yamato Damashii, is fractured, yet his eyes remain sharp. He expected a cave of demons, a chaotic workshop of a desperate enemy. Instead, as the heavy blast doors of the hangar deck hiss open, he is met by a sight that strikes deeper than the shrapnel in his thigh. The hangar is not a dark hull of war. It is a brilliantly lit cathedral of industrial might. Row upon row of Hellcats sit in silent, terrifying symmetry, their blue skins gleaming under a sea of fluorescent lights. There is no clutter, no frantic rushing, no makeshift repairs. Tanaka watches as a young American sailor, barely 20, walks toward a radial engine. The sailor does not carry a hammer or a prayer. He carries a polished steel torque wrench. The tool catches the light, a silver needle in a haystack of machinery. To Tanaka, who watched his mechanics in Rabaul tighten bolts by feel and instinct until they snapped, the sight of this standardized instrument is a revelation of a different kind of power. The background of this moment is etched in the failure of the Japanese logistical imagination. 4 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had operated on the razor's edge of attrition. Their philosophy was one of the decisive battle, a singular, violent stroke where spirit would overcome material. They built the Zero to be a masterpiece of lightness, fast, agile, and utterly devoid of armor. It was a weapon designed for the offensive, a samurai sword that shattered if hit. In contrast, the American hangar deck was an extension of the factory floor in Detroit or Pittsburgh. It was built on the premise that the machine must serve the man, and the man must be preserved at all costs. Tanaka feels a cold tremor as he observes the safety markings on the deck. Bright yellow lines dictate the movement of every cart. Fire hoses are coiled with the precision of ceremonial silks. In his own world, a fire meant the end of a ship, a chaotic scramble against the inevitable. Here, the Americans seem to have tamed the very elements of disaster. He looks at the steel torque wrench again, tucked into the sailor's belt. It represents more than maintenance. It represents a society that has the luxury of being perfect. As the sailor begins to calibrate the cowling of a nearby fighter, the rhythmic click-click-click of the wrench echoes against the steel bulkheads. It is the sound of a clock ticking down the hours of the empire, a mechanical heartbeat that ignores the frantic bravery of the individual in favor of the relentless, safe, and overwhelming logic of the machine. The contrast between the two warring philosophies was never more apparent than in the marrow of their aviation doctrine. For the Japanese High Command, the pilot was a refined spirit encased in a temporary vessel. The A6M0 was the physical manifestation of this ethos, an aircraft so stripped of weight that it lacked self-sealing fuel tanks or pilot armor. It was built for a short, glorious life of maneuverability and offensive dominance. To add safety features was seen as a lack of faith in the pilot skill, a betrayal of the Bushido code that prioritized the warrior's willingness to die over his ability to survive. By 1944, this quality of spirit was being systematically dismantled by the quality of industry. As Tanaka watched from the edge of the hangar deck, the historical weight of this disparity settled over him. American philosophy operated on a fundamentally different axis. The United States did not view its pilots as expendable sparks of divinity, but as highly trained, irreplaceable assets of a democratic state. The aircraft, consequently, were built as heavy, rugged lifeboats. A Grumman Hellcat was not merely a fighter. It was a sophisticated industrial product designed to bring its operator home even after absorbing hundreds of rounds of machine gun fire. This was the survivability gap, a gap that was widened not just by steel plates, but by the obsessive culture of maintenance and safety protocols that Tanaka was now witnessing. The Americans had institutionalized the preservation of life through a relentless attention to detail. In the Japanese camps, a mechanic might spend his entire day hand-filing a single part to fit a specific engine, creating a unique artisanal machine that could not be easily repaired in the heat of battle. On the Essex, Tanaka saw the triumph of the interchangeable part. He watched a maintenance crew swap out a hydraulic pump with the practiced ease of a pit crew. Each man used the steel torque wrench, ensuring that every bolt was tightened to the exact foot-pound specified in a thick, standardized manual. This was not the work of individual genius. It was the work of a collective, disciplined system. This logistical superiority was the true, secret weapon of the Pacific. While the Japanese struggled to supply their forward bases with even basic fuel and ammunition, the Americans were operating floating cities that possessed more technical infrastructure than most Japanese prefectures. The sheer abundance of safety equipment, the fire suppressant foams, the specialized lifting cranes, and the ubiquitous presence of the steel torque wrench pointed to a civilization that did not fear scarcity. They did not need to ask for a miracle from the gods because they had mastered the physics of the mundane. For Tanaka, the realization was bitter. The Americans weren't just winning the war, they were out-engineering the very concept of sacrifice. They had replaced the desperate courage of the individual with the calm, mechanical certainty of the safety-checked machine. The heavy elevator hummed with a mechanical vitality that Tanaka found unnerving. As the platform descended into the bowels of the carrier, he expected the gloom of a cavern, a place of oil-slicked floors and the frantic, soot-covered mechanics he knew from the airfields of Truk and Rabaul. Instead, as the lights of the hangar deck flooded his vision, he was forced to squint against a brilliance that felt almost offensive. The hangar was a vast, climate-controlled sanctuary of aluminum and white light. It was scrubbed clean, devoid of the filth and desperation that usually accompanied the machinery of war. To Tanaka, it did not look like a workshop. It looked like a laboratory where the primary experiment was the perfection of the mundane. He watched a team of sailors moving with a synchronized, rhythmic efficiency that lacked the harsh shouting of his own commanders. They wore color-coded jerseys, red for ordnance, green for maintenance, purple for fuel, a visual language of organization that stripped away the fog of war. In Japan, the mechanic was a shadow, a servant to the pilot's glory. Here, the mechanic was an essential gear in a clockwork empire. Tanaka noted the lack of improvisation. There were no wooden blocks propping up tailwheels, no scavenged wires being twisted into place. Every tool sat in a designated silhouette on a shadow board. Every drop of spilled hydraulic fluid was chased by a man with a mop as if cleanliness were a tactical requirement. The historical reality of the American hangar was one of unprecedented scale and standardization. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had transitioned from a fleet struggling for survival into a global logistics corporation. The sheer volume of equipment available on a single Essex-class carrier dwarfed the entire output of some Japanese industrial sectors. Tanaka observed a stack of crated engines, each one identical, each one wrapped in moisture-proof plastic. In his world, an engine was a temperamental beast to be coaxed into life by a master technician. Here, engines were treated like light bulbs, expendable, replaceable, and perfectly consistent. The Americans had removed the soul from the machine to ensure its reliability. At the center of this organized tranquility sat the steel torque wrench, wielded by a teenage sailor who checked a checklist with a pencil before every turn. Tanaka realized that the pilot he had fought in the air was only the final link in a chain of safety that began here, on this spotless deck. The American pilot didn't need to worry if his fuel lines were secure or if his oxygen system would fail at 20,000 feet. A dozen men and 100 calibrated tools had already guaranteed it. This was the realization that made Tanaka's hands tremble. He was not fighting a group of men, but a civilization that had conquered the possibility of error. The hangar was a testament to the fact that American abundance was not just about the number of planes, but about the mathematical certainty that every plane would function exactly as intended. The contrast manifested physically in the silhouettes of the aircraft themselves. Tanaka looked at a nearby Hellcat, its fuselage thick, blunt, and unapologetically rugged. It was a beast of burden compared to the predatory grace of his Zero. The Zero was a masterwork of weight reduction, a fragile shell of G-type aluminum alloy that lacked even a basic fire extinguishing system. In the early years of the war, this lightness had allowed Japanese pilots to dance around their enemies, but by 1944, that lack of protection had turned the Zero into a flying lighter. A single burst of .50 caliber fire from an American wing would ignite the Japanese aircraft instantly, turning a pilot's years of training into a brief, screaming fireball. The American Hellcat was the antithesis of this philosophy. It was designed around a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine, encased in over 200 pounds of cockpit armor. Tanaka reached out with a bound hand, touching the edge of a self-sealing fuel tank that had been removed for inspection. The thick, rubbery lining was designed to swell shut when punctured, a luxury of safety that the Japanese High Command had deemed too heavy for their own planes. To the Americans, weight was a secondary concern to the survival of the operator. They believed that a pilot who survived a crash was a pilot who could return to the air the next day, bringing his hard-won experience back into the fight. This technical divergence reflected a deeper emotional rift. Japanese aviators were taught that their lives were lighter than a feather, a disposable element in a divine struggle. They were expected to compensate for technical inferiority with superior spiritual resolve. But as Tanaka observed the American maintenance crews, he saw no evidence of spiritual frenzy. Instead, he saw the calm, methodical application of engineering. He watched a mechanic discard a perfectly good-looking bolt simply because it had exceeded its rated hours of service. In Japan, every bolt was precious, reused until it failed. Here, the steel torque wrench ensured that no part was ever pushed beyond its limit. The emotional impact of this realization was devastating. Tanaka had been prepared to face a cruel, decadent enemy, but he found instead a society that took the concept of safety with the same religious seriousness that he applied to the emperor. The Americans did not ask their men to be martyrs. They gave them armored glass and fire-resistant suits. They fought with a mechanical democracy where the lowest seaman was equipped with the best tools available. Seeing the physical evidence of this commitment, the sheer mass and redundancy of the American equipment, Tanaka felt the first pangs of a terrifying thought, that his own culture's obsession with sacrifice was not a sign of strength, but a mask for a fatal lack of industrial foresight. The Hellcat was not just a plane. It was a promise made by a nation to its soldiers that their lives mattered. Suddenly, a sharp klaxon cut through the rhythmic hum of the hangar, a sound that in Tanaka's world signaled an imminent air raid or a desperate scramble to launch. He braced his shoulders, expecting the Americans to break into a panic, for sailors to collide and officers to scream orders as they prepared for death. Instead, the activity on the deck did not accelerate. It stopped with a clinical, synchronized precision. This was a safety stand-down, a concept entirely alien to the Imperial Japanese Navy. A small puddle of oil had been spotted near a catapult track, and the entire section of the hangar had been frozen to address the hazard. Tanaka watched, transfixed, as a specialized cleanup crew moved in. They did not treat the spill as a nuisance to be ignored in the name of the mission. They treated it as a primary enemy. Factual records of the era reveal that the U.S. Navy's obsession with damage control and operational safety was a calculated pillar of their strategy. While the Japanese military often viewed accidents as inevitable casualties of war or lapses in spiritual focus, the Americans viewed them as preventable drains on their industrial momentum. A single slip on an oily deck could injure a deckhand, and to the Americans, That deckhand was a cog in the machine that they could not afford to lose. The contrast in priorities was staggering. Tanaka remembered the flight decks of the Akagi and Kaga, where gasoline fumes often lingered in stagnant pockets, ignored by crews driven to the point of exhaustion. In the Japanese doctrine, the mission was everything. The environment was secondary. Here, the mission was paused to ensure the environment remained perfect. He saw an American officer walking the line with a clipboard, checking not the readiness of the guns, but the expiration dates on the fire extinguishers. There was a quiet, pervasive confidence in this pause. It signaled that the Americans had so much time, so many resources, and such a massive lead in the conflict that they could afford to stop the war to wipe a floor. This obsession with safety protocols was a psychological blow to the captive pilot. It stripped away the myth of the soft American. Tanaka realized that their lack of desperation was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of absolute control. The steel torque wrench remained at the center of this observation, hanging from the belt of a sailor who waited patiently for the safety clearance. The tool, like the protocol itself, was a symbol of a society that valued the integrity of the process over the theater of heroism. The Americans were not merely fighting a war, they were managing a high-risk industry with the goal of zero loss. As the all-clear finally sounded and the crews returned to their stations with methodical calm, Tanaka understood that a nation that prioritizes the safety of a single sailor over the speed of a launch is a nation that has already decided it cannot be defeated. The sailor did not rely on his senses alone to determine if the aircraft was ready for the sky. He reached for his belt and withdrew the steel torque wrench, a tool that functioned as the scepter of this industrial kingdom. Tanaka watched as the young man fitted the socket to a critical mounting bolt on the engine frame. There was no guesswork, no tightening until the metal groaned, as was the custom in the makeshift workshops of the Japanese island bases. Instead, the sailor applied a steady, measured pressure until a distinct metallic click signaled that the exact tension had been reached. It was a sound of absolute finality, a mechanical verification that transcended human error. In the Japanese aviation industry, precision was the domain of the master craftsman, the veteran mechanic who had spent decades learning the feel of the steel. This created a bottleneck of expertise. If a master mechanic died in a bombing raid, the technical knowledge of the squadron died with him. The Americans, however, had democratized precision. By providing every 18-year-old enlistee with a steel torque wrench and a set of standardized instructions, they had moved the intelligence of the repair from the man into the tool. Tanaka realized with a sinking heart that the American ability to mass-produce expertise was just as lethal as their ability to mass-produce airframes. The wrench became, in Tanaka's eyes, a recurring symbol of the democratic machine. It represented a world where a farm boy from Iowa could wield the same technical authority as a Ph.D. in engineering, provided he followed the safety protocols. The tool ensured that every Hellcat across the entire Pacific Fleet was maintained to the same exacting standard. There were no lucky planes and no cursed engines. There was only the standard. This uniformity was a terrifying prospect for a warrior who believed in the primacy of the individual spirit. The steel torque wrench didn't care about the bravery of the pilot or the glory of the mission. It only cared about the mathematical integrity of the bolt. As the mechanic moved from one fastener to the next, the rhythmic clicking filled the hangar like the heartbeat of a giant. It was the sound of a civilization that had eliminated the need for luck. Tanaka thought of the hundreds of Japanese planes that had fallen from the sky due to simple mechanical fatigue or improperly tightened fittings, failures that were often blamed on the pilot's lack of focus. Here, the failure was intercepted before it ever left the deck. The steel torque wrench was the gatekeeper. It was the physical evidence that American freedom was backed by a rigid, scientific discipline. To the captive pilot, that small, gleaming tool was more intimidating than a battery of anti-aircraft guns. The guns could miss, but the wrench and the safety it guaranteed never did. This transformation of ideology was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing erosion of Tanaka's most fundamental beliefs. He had been raised to view the West as a collection of individualistic, undisciplined souls who would crumble when faced with the collective spiritual might of Japan. He expected to find a military held together by fear and desperation, yet what he saw in the hangar was a profound, quiet unity. The American sailors didn't work under the threat of the lash or the promise of a glorious death in the name of a god-king. Instead, they were united by a shared devotion to the integrity of their machines. The realization began to dawn on him that the American individualism he had been taught to despise was actually a system that empowered the individual to be a steward of a much larger, indestructible force. He watched as a young mechanic, having finished his task, carefully wiped the steel torque wrench and returned it to its velvet-lined case. This act of reverence for a tool was a mirror to Tanaka's own reverence for his ancestors, yet it was rooted in the living present. The American spirit was not found in ancient scrolls or suicide poems, but in the rigorous adherence to a maintenance manual. This was a devastating shift in perspective. Tanaka realized that while Japan was burning its youth as fuel for a failing engine of war, the Americans were using their wealth to buy time, safety, and survival for their own. The ideological pillar that had sustained him, the idea that material wealth was a sign of moral decay, collapsed under the weight of the evidence before him. The historical records of Japanese prisoner-of-war interrogations often noted this specific psychological fracture. Many captured pilots, once exposed to the scale of American logistics, went through a period of deep depression followed by a strange, quiet admiration. They saw that the American abundance was not a symptom of greed, but a tool of liberation. By removing the fear of mechanical failure and the necessity of martyrdom, the Americans had created a combat environment where a pilot could focus entirely on the art of flight. Tanaka looked at his own scarred hands and thought of the friends he had lost to engine fires and structural collapses, losses that had been stoically accepted as fate. Seeing the steel torque wrench in action revealed that those deaths had been unnecessary. They weren't sacrifices to a divine cause, they were casualties of a logistical failure. This new ideology was terrifying because it was practical. It was a philosophy of the good enough and the built to last that superseded the beautiful death. Tanaka understood now that the war was not being fought on a battlefield of spirits, but on a landscape of industrial safety. The Americans were winning because they had decided that a war was something to be managed, solved, and survived. As he was moved further down the line of aircraft, past the gleaming fire suppression nozzles and the rows of perfectly pressurized oxygen tanks, Tanaka felt the last of his defiance wither. He was no longer a warrior of the sun fighting against the darkness. He was a man from an impoverished past witnessing a future where the machine, and the safety it provided, was the ultimate arbor of truth. As the guards moved Tanaka further down the deck, they passed the threshold where the machine shop met the crew's domestic life, and the boundary between war and comfort blurred into a single, overwhelming display of logistical dominance. To his left, a machinist was using a lathe to shave a piece of high-grade steel with the same nonchalance one might use to peel a fruit. To his right, through an open bulkhead, Tanaka caught a glimpse of the mess hall. There, under the same brilliant lights, sailors sat before mounds of white bread, chilled butter, and bowls of canned peaches. The proximity was staggering. In the Japanese Navy, the front line was a place of starvation and spiritual training through deprivation. Here, the Americans maintained their bodies with the same caloric precision they used to maintain their engines. The historical reality of American shipboard life was a psychological weapon in its own right. A single carrier like the Essex housed massive refrigeration units, laundry facilities, and even soda fountains, luxuries that were virtually non-existent in the Japanese fleet by 1944. Tanaka observed a fire station where the brass nozzles were polished to a mirror finish, flanked by heavy asbestos suits and portable oxygen canisters. In Japan, firefighting was a desperate struggle of bucket brigades and wet blankets. Here, it was a specialized science supported by a dedicated industrial infrastructure. The Americans had realized that to protect the ship, they had to provide the men with tools that were more advanced than the weapons of their enemies. This observation of the dual front of safety and sustenance deepened Tanaka's despair. He saw that the steel torque wrench and the chilled butter were parts of the same whole, a commitment to the preservation of the individual. The Americans did not expect their men to fight on empty stomachs or fly in broken machines, because they understood that human endurance has a physical limit. By providing every safety net imaginable, from armored cockpits to standardized nutrition, they pushed that limit further than any spiritual indoctrination ever could. Tanaka watched a sailor casually toss a half-eaten piece of bread into a waste bin, an act of waste that would have been a capital offense in his own starving unit. It wasn't just abundance, it was the total absence of fear regarding the future. The emotional weight of this realization was heavier than any physical blow. Tanaka understood that the American fire suppression systems and high-calorie diets were not signs of softness, but of a terrifyingly efficient pragmatism. A sailor who is well-fed and equipped with a fire-resistant suit is a sailor who can remain at his post when the bombs start falling. The Americans were not winning because they were more courageous, but because they had built a world where courage was supported by a billion-dollar safety infrastructure. As he looked at the intricate network of overhead sprinklers and the heavy fire doors, Tanaka felt the last vestiges of his cultural superiority slip away. The Americans were not just fighting a war, they were exporting a standard of living that made his own country's vision of a new order look like a primitive relic of a bygone age. The internal breakdown of Lieutenant Tanaka's resolve reached its zenith as he stood paralyzed by a singular, haunting realization. The divine wind could not blow through a room made of steel and science. For months, the propaganda of the home islands had sustained him with the promise that the spiritual purity of the Japanese soul would ultimately triumph over the material decadence of the West. He had been taught that the American sailor was a mercenary, a man of weak character who would flee when faced with the absolute self-sacrifice of the kamikaze. But as he stood in the heart of the Essex, he saw that the Americans had created a form of sacrifice that was far more terrifying because it was anonymous and mechanical. Their spirit was not found in a final suicidal plunge, but in the millions of man-hours spent ensuring a fire would never start, a bolt would never loosen, and a pilot would never be left to fend for himself. The psychological toll of this discovery was a total collapse of his worldview. In the Japanese military, the pilot was the centerpiece, a tragic hero whose death was the ultimate expression of loyalty. In the American hangar, the pilot was merely the most visible part of a massive, self-correcting organism. Tanaka looked at the steel torque wrench resting on a nearby workbench and saw it for what it truly was, a weapon of mass-produced certainty. It was the physical manifestation of a society that refused to leave its fate to the gods. The Americans did not pray for victory. They engineered it, one calibrated turn at a time. The crushing weight of this industrial logic made his own culture's reliance on spirit look like a desperate, primitive superstition. He realized that a nation that builds a safety net for every soul it sends into battle is a nation that possesses a moral and material strength that can never be broken by a single, desperate act of valor. Factual observations of captured Axis personnel often mirrored this specific trauma, the trauma of abundance. Tanaka realized that the American obsession with safety was not a sign of fear, but a sign of absolute dominance. They could afford to be safe because they were already winning. They could afford to value the life of a single mechanic because they had already mastered the art of the infinite. In contrast, the Japanese reliance on the divine wind, the takotai, was an admission of bankruptcy. It was the act of a gambler who had lost everything and was now betting with the lives of his children. The sight of the American safety protocols, the fire suppression foams, and the armored bulkheads was the final proof that the war was not a struggle of wills, but a demonstration of industrial evolution. As Tanaka watched a fresh squadron of pilots walk toward their planes, laughing and checking their survival gear with a casual, practiced ease, the last of his ideological armor fell away. He saw that they were not afraid because they knew the system behind them was infallible. They were backed by the steel torque wrench, the mess hall, the machine shop, and 1,000 safety checks that ensured their survival was the priority of the state. The Imperial Japanese Navy had asked Tanaka to die for a cause. The United States Navy had asked these men to live for one. In that moment, the internal conflict that had defined Tanaka's life was resolved by a bitter, undeniable truth. The divine wind was a myth, but the American hangar was a reality. He understood now that Japan had not just lost a war. They had lost a future to a civilization that understood that the ultimate power is not the ability to kill, but the organized, scientific will to preserve. The transition from the hangar deck to the prisoner of war ward was the final journey of Tanaka's old life. As he lay on a clean cot, the distant rhythmic click-click-click of the steel torque wrench still echoed in his mind, no longer a sound of the enemy, but the ticking clock of a new era. The American carrier was a floating testament to a truth that the Imperial Japanese Navy had tried to obscure with the smoke of incense and the fire of fanaticism. That the ultimate measure of a civilization is not how beautifully it can die, but how meticulously it can preserve the living. The hangar, with its sanitized decks, its redundant fire systems, and its obsessive focus on mechanical integrity, was a temple of a modern, democratic faith. It was a place where the sanctity of the individual was guarded by the precision of the machine, and where the preservation of a single life was considered the highest form of military efficiency. This poetic reflection on the American hangar reveals a larger truth about the clash of ideologies in the Second World War. Japan had fought with the tools of the past, swords, spirits, and the willingness to burn out like falling blossoms. But the Americans had fought with the tools of the future. They had understood that abundance is not merely the possession of things, but the creation of a system where no one is expendable. The steel torque wrench was the scepter of this new world order, a tool that ensured that the power of the state was used to support, rather than consume, the citizen. Tanaka realized that the divine wind had never stood a chance against a nation that built safety into its very foundation. The wind is a fleeting, temperamental thing, but a machine maintained with the discipline of a free people is a force that moves the world. As the Essex turned into the wind to launch its next strike, the hangar remained a quiet hive of industry. The mechanics continued their work, the mess halls continued to steam with fresh food, and the safety protocols remained the iron law of the deck. For Tanaka, the war was over, but the lesson had just begun. He saw that the American victory was not just a victory of steel over wood, or oil over spirit, but a victory of the future over the past. It was the triumph of a culture that valued the safety of its children enough to build them armored cages and give them the best tools science could provide. In the quiet of the ward, surrounded by the hum of American industry, Tanaka finally understood that freedom is not found in the freedom to die for a cause, but in the collective, organized will to ensure that every man has the chance to live for one.